Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for coming. My name is Sunny Wong. So I'm really happy to see tonight that we have Jim Hoggan speaking for us. And boy, oh boy, when I read his bio, I thought, this is one impressive guy. Please welcome Jim Hoggan.
Thank you. I have to start anytime I speak in public these days by saying that I'm not speaking on behalf of the David Suzuki Foundation. So any of these comments that I might make about anyone up here are my own. So I'm more speaking as an author. I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. When I was 7, I was in a park with a friend of mine. His name was Donnie Fisherman. And this was a park near our home that had this big dirt cave that some people had over time, I guess, carved into the side of the hill. And there was a fairly good-sized mouth to this cave, and it was quite big. And then right at the very end of the cave, there was like this little chimney exit. And so this one day, he and I were playing in this cave. And along came a gang of bigger kids that started pushing us around, taunting us, and eventually ended up covering the mouth of the cave and the exit of the cave with these big pieces of plywood. And so this was, maybe he and I were just like easily terrified in the dark and confined space of this cave, but the more we got upset and yelled and screamed to get out, the more fun they had. And when I think back when I grew up in Calgary, I actually ran into a fair amount of that, of bullying, because I grew up in a fairly rough part of town. When I was that age, as I was growing up to be a teenager, though, I decided that I was not going to be the victim of bullies. I was a lucky person, and I just decided I was going to fight back. But for those of you who maybe have been the victims of bullies or have friends that have been the victims of bullies, you know that that's kind of a dangerous way to think about bullying, is fighting back, because once you start to do that, the difference between the bully and you becomes kind of harder to distinguish. But I was really lucky. I grew up in the 60s. Bullying was out. Violence was out. Buddhism was in. Meditation was in. Peace was in. And even though I grew up in a fairly rough part of Calgary, I ended up with a fairly cool group of friends. And as time went on, I realized that not only was I going to fight back, but I realized that I wasn't going to be a bully in order to stop people from bullying me. And, there's no need to feel sorry for me. I had a great life. I grew up, went to law school, developed a big, successful business. But my business is kind of a crisis and issues business, and when you hang around with David Suzuki, you definitely are in the crisis and issues business. I remember I was sitting one time in Calgary in a course I was taking with a bunch of oil guys on board governance. And once this happened over a number of weeks that I was taking this course. And these guys would just really go out of their way to talk to me, even though they didn't know me from Adam because of my relationship with Suzuki. And they would be at my lunch table and coffee table and, every break just to kind of challenge me on something that David had said recently. And so after a while, they settled down and started to treat me like one of the gang, and things were going along fine. And then we sort of broke and came back maybe about a month later for a second weekend. And the first thing that happens is, when I come in, is my chair where I was supposed to be sitting, somebody had taken the front page of the Calgary Herald and sort of spread it out like this. And it had Suzuki right on the top fold of the paper saying that the premier should be thrown in jail because of the things that they're doing in the oil sands. And so all of these guys had, decided it was time to find out from me what kind of PR advice that was that I was giving David, right? Which I kind of responded to that question by saying that, David is not the kind of guy who takes PR advice. Anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. It was funny, I was reading the Calgary Herald not too long ago. In fact, I actually went to the Neil Young concert in Calgary and the news conference that he had. And there was a woman there named Alicia Corbella. She's an editor for the Calgary Herald. And basically, her whole narrative about Neil Young was that he was a hypocrite because he flew in private jets and he left his buses running when he was doing concerts. Didn't even write anything in her piece about the treaty that he was talking to people about. It was just all about, are you a hypocrite? The first question she asked was essentially an are you a hypocrite question in the press conference. And I've seen the same thing happen to Suzuki, where you have Ezra Levant trying to convince Canadians that David Suzuki is a multi-millionaire landowner that really is also a hypocrite. I've also seen people in the environmental community referring to the oil sands as heroin. In my mind, this kind of language is a type of bullying. And the other day I was reading the New York Times, and Philip Roth was actually talking about being bullied. And he put it very eloquently. He said, bullies are saying, you are not what you think you are. You are not what you say you are. You are what we think you are. You are what we choose you to be. So this is in my mind, when I talk about bullying, what I mean is this attempt at social control, bullying in the public square. So in my book, in this new book, The Polluted Public Square, I'm interviewing some of the world's leading public intellectuals, talking to them about the state of public discourse on the environment. I had tea in the House of Lords with Baroness O'Neill, who's a British expert on public trust. I spent time with Harvard's Marshall Gantz, the guy who developed the Obama ground game in the 2008 and 2012 elections. I interviewed MIT's experts on transformative change, Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer. I even traveled to the Himalayas to interview the Dalai Lama. So I've spent 3 years asking remarkable people this question. Why, in spite of all of the scientific evidence and concern that we hear from experts in atmospheric, marine, and life sciences, are we doing so little to fix the big environmental problems that we're creating? And again, another part of the question is, why isn't public discourse more data-driven? I met a guy at Columbia University named Eric Johnson, and he said, his question was, why are we listening to each other shout rather than listening to what the evidence is trying to tell us? I interviewed a cognitive scientist who teaches at Yale Law School. His name is Dan Kahan. And he said this, something that really basically put me on a path with my book. He said, just as you can pollute the natural environment, you can pollute public conversations. And he pointed out that public conversation is a public good that deserves to be protected every bit as much as the natural environment. But as any of you who follow environmental issues in Canada know, that's not our attitude in Canada these days. Not long ago, Canada's oil and gas industry launched a PR campaign with this message: ethical oil is like fair trade coffee or conflict-free diamonds. It's morally superior. Now, as part of this campaign, the oil and gas industry worked very closely with the Conservative government to convince Canadians that British Columbians who oppose pipelines and tankers on the coast were extremists working for American business interests. Now, as much as I hate to admit this, environmental activists have also done their fair share of polluting the public square. I've heard them calling the oil sands blood oil. They claim that oil companies are environmental criminals engaged in crimes against humanity. You know, it's hard to imagine that this level of rhetoric could get worse, but then came along Senator Mike Duffy, who called environmental charities in BC un-Canadian. Peter Kent accused them of money laundering. The PMO called them foreign-funded radicals. Senator Don Platt said, where would environmentalists draw the line on who they would take money from? Would they take money from Al-Qaeda, from Hamas, or the Taliban? So, this is just a few years ago, as Terry Glavin put it, suddenly we had sleeper cells of Ducks Unlimited popping up across Canada. You know, I don't want to give you the idea of equivalency here, that I'm not suggesting equivalency. These environmentalists have alarming evidence about climate change, and they're arguing against the inaction of an industry that is in a lot of trouble as the world realizes that its product is actually warming the climate. And they haven't done a very good job of dealing with this issue. So as my interviews unfolded, I was lucky enough to find myself in a coffee shop in Harlem with this really amazing American philosopher named Jason Stanley. He writes for the New York Times, and he teaches philosophy of language and a class on democracy and propaganda at Yale. And he told me that when oil from Fort McMurray is called ethical oil, or coal from West Virginia is called clean coal, it's difficult to have a real discussion about the pros and cons. He explained that improbable assertions, such as these, where words are misappropriated and meanings are twisted, that these are not so much about making substantive claims as they are about silencing. He called them linguistic strategies for stealing the voices of others. And he said, Fox News engages in silencing when it describes itself as fair and balanced to an audience that's perfectly aware that it's neither. And that the effect of saying that they're fair and balanced is to suggest there's no such thing as fair and balanced. There's no possibility of balanced news, only propaganda. So, in my view, Canada's public square is becoming polluted with a toxic form of rhetoric that insinuates there are no facts, there is no objectivity, and that everyone is just out to try and manipulate you for their own interests. So, when everything's mislabeled, and you can't trust what anyone says, why bother? And that's something that the American linguist Deborah Tannen described as this. This is the problem. When you hear a ruckus outside your house, you open the window to see what's going on. But if there's a ruckus every night, you close the shutters and ignore it. The Dalai Lama basically says, I think he said something like, when he was here last time, he said, we're raising a generation of passive bystanders. And this is how. And this polarized rhetoric that you see in Canada has made us less able to weigh facts honestly, disagree constructively, or think things through collectively. So what do you do about this kind of pollution in the public square? That's a big question for 20 or 30 minutes, but let me try this first on you. I'm right, you're wrong, let me tell you what you should think is not a good communication strategy. That's something that moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt told me. And he said, this doesn't work because everyone thinks they're right. So he argues that people are divided by politics and religion, not because some people are good and other people are bad, but because our minds were designed for groupish righteousness. And he argues that morality both binds us and blinds us. He says our righteous minds were designed by evolution to unite us into teams, divide us against other teams, and then blind us to the truth. Now Dan Kahan, the guy from Yale, puts it a little bit differently. He says the trouble starts when the communication environment fills up with toxic partisan meanings that effectively announce that if you are one of us, believe this. Otherwise, you are one of them. So Haidt suggests that we step outside the self-righteousness of what he calls our moral matrix, and that we look to the Dalai Lama to see the power of moral humility, and that we take the time to understand the values and worldviews of people that we disagree with. I interviewed 2008 TED Prize winner Karen Armstrong, who wrote The History of God, and who developed something called the Charter for Compassion. And she put it this way: we must speak out against injustice, but not in a way that causes more hatred. She told me, remember what St. Paul said, charity takes no delight in the wrongdoing of others. So a few years ago, as I was in the middle of this book, David Suzuki and I had this incredible pleasure of spending the afternoon with a Zen Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh. And Thich Nhat Hanh was basically trying to convince David, as I recall, that people didn't need to hear more terrible stories about the environment. They already knew we were destroying the planet, but that he needed to focus on the despair that people were feeling. If you don't deal with the despair, he said. And so as I was listening to him, I kept feeling like he was saying that we should meditate. And so I said to him, I know that I talked to one of your monks yesterday, and he told me that in Vietnam, when your monks and nuns were being harassed by local policemen, that you used to put the pictures of these policemen up on your website. So you're not saying that we shouldn't be activists, that we shouldn't speak out, that Canadians expect David Suzuki to speak up and defend the environment. And he looked at me, and I don't know if you've ever met him or anyone like him, but he had this way of looking at you that was, piercing doesn't quite describe it. It's sort of like touching your soul kind of look. And it was like he was like looking right into me. And he said, speak the truth, but not to punish. And I think I must have stopped breathing when I heard that. And as I was walking down off the stage, and they were turning the cameras off this interview, my wife was in the front row, and she said, now you heard what he said, right? You heard what he said. Because we have a bit of a reputation at D-Smog Blog for speaking the truth and punishing. So it took me a little while, but I couldn't get that out of my head. And I realized, like, somebody, as I told you, that in my early life, I've read like lots of different Eastern books from Tibet and Japan and China, and particularly about Buddhism. And I realized that I had been given a Zen koan. You know what those are? These are meditative kind of puzzles, right? By like one of the greatest living Zen masters. This is a very serious guy. And so I was trying to think, okay, what does that mean? I just speak the truth, but not to punish. And so it just would keep sticking in the back of my mind. So I wanted to share with you 3 things that, for me, this means. You know, especially when you look like, and I live in a world where public conversations are basically shoving matches. So what does that mean when you live in a world where you're expected to speak up, and the way that the debates about these issues are being conducted is shoving matches, right? So here's the first one. Never be afraid of the consequences that arise from speaking the truth. There's nothing wrong with a good fight over an injustice. In fact, Marshall Gantz, who I interviewed at Harvard, amazing guy, argues that taking a conciliatory stance in the face of wrongdoing is both strategically and morally a mistake. He says that it severely compromises what he calls the adversarial mechanisms that citizens rely on to bring out the truth. We live in a democracy where leaders are expected to raise the level of debate to help people sort out the truth. So I was actually at this point, when I was talking to Gantz about polarization, I was at the point where I was trying to sort of write about polarization, and I was kind of like saying, you know, we got to like really tone down the polarization, right? So I see him on PBS, and he's saying, I have no time for people who argue against polarization. He said, contention lies at the heart of democracy. So I watched this PBS, and then I phoned him. And he's just such a generous guy. He took my call, talked to me. And he was trying to make this argument to me. And I said, and he said, I'll send you some stuff by Rabbi Hillel. So I waited. I got very quickly. This guy, for a guy who's as busy as him, is very generous. So within a couple hours, I had this package, and I was sort of reading through. So Rabbi Hillel was alive at the time of Jesus. Marshall Gantz describes him as not having quite a good marketing campaign as Jesus has had. But Hillel distinguished between what he called argument for the sake of heaven and argument for the sake of defeat. One is good. Argument for the sake of heaven helps people get to the truth. Argument for the sake of defeating your opponent is basically not so good. That it is really the business of steamrolling the other person and is not necessarily something that's constructive in society. Gantz said, the goal of an argument and a public debate should not be winning or crushing someone who disagrees with you, but bringing forward the truth. So the next thing that I think about this Zen koan, speak the truth but not to punish, is that it means that we need to police our own attitudes. Peter Senge, I took a course from him. He's this amazing guy who teaches at MIT's Sloan School of Business. He's like one of the world's leading systems thinkers. This is what he said this was basically the theme of this week-long course that I took with him last August. The success of an intervention depends on the inner mindset of the intervener. The success of an intervention depends on the inner mindset of the intervener. We want to strive to be that kind of person who realizes that you have to take the board out of your own eye before you take the speck out of someone else's. As long as we see someone else as the sole source of the problem, we will not see our way through it. I ran into a very interesting guy. His name is Roger Connor. He teaches law at Vanderbilt Law School. And he says that most of us have attitudes towards, most people who are sort of active on important public issues, most of us have attitudes towards other people or groups that are determined by their behavior towards us. In our perceptions, we tend to treat someone who disagrees with us in public as an aggressor. And then both sides are doing this, so very quickly, what's drawn from that perspective is that they start to treat each other as enemies. And so what he says is that your stance ends up being created or determined by other people's behavior. It's a reaction. This is very similar to that, argument for the sake of heaven, argument for the sake of defeat, right? Problem. So Connor says that it takes conscious thought and discipline to generate our attitudes towards others from the inside, rather than having them develop from the outside as a reflection of their behavior towards us. People who monitor their attitudes, Connor says, who monitor their attitudes towards others and don't allow resentment to boil up, can eventually start to hear what another person is saying. So this is something that Connor calls the advocacy trap, and that he feels the solution to it is developing greater capacity for self-awareness and self-control, because resentment is like a drug. He also warns against what can happen to righteous indignation, that people who work for the betterment of society often feel it's the fuel that energizes them to do their work. But he says there's a danger that can turn into self-righteousness. And it takes discipline and self-awareness to avoid this. So then, the third and final is speaking the truth but not to punish also means practicing what you might call nonviolent speech. Gandhi believed in bringing about social and political change through what he called ahimsa, which is the idea of causing no injury to others through your deeds or through your words. So another one of these very remarkable people that I met was a guy named Bryant Welch, who runs this Buddhist university in San Francisco. He's a lawyer and a psychotherapist. And I was sitting with him in a houseboat in Sausalito, where he lives. Right, I'm sure the room we were in was where he actually counsels people, because it was very quiet and peaceful. And he was talking to me about conflict. And this is what he said. One of the reasons I think nonviolence is so effective is because the lack of response from the victim undercuts the projective devices that adversaries use to justify their aggression. If the victim remains silent rather than responding aggressively, it's much harder to sustain the aggression because the perpetrator is left to stew in their own ugliness. We all like to view ourselves in some way as justified, And when the perpetrator is denied the justification that their own projections create, they are slowed in their attempts at self-justification. So, you can see this is a work in progress, but at least it's a work in progress, right? Which is better than it was before this 3 years started. So my time's up, but I just wanted to end on one last thing. So when I interviewed the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, we stood up at the end of this interview and he reached out to try to touch my forehead with his finger. And he said, "We sometimes think the Western mind is more sophisticated, but I think the Tibetan heart has something to offer. The Asian heart may actually be stronger. Perhaps if we combine the Western mind and the Eastern heart, we can be successful." And so I can't help but think, that maybe that's partly it. That when people on either side of these contentious issues are operating in such different realities, that we're talking past each other, and that we're so far apart that communications and progress on the issues just isn't taking place. That maybe it's not anger or more facts that are needed, but warmer hearts. Simple, but missing. Anyway, thank you.